When considering the question on can somebody be doing their job for the next 10 years, the two biggest factors that come into play with that and their ability to sustain that level of work is their ability to be gritty and to be resilient. Very often these words are used interchangeably, but I think they're actually quite different. And I think a lot of people are quite good at being gritty and can prepare for this, but they forget about the resilience piece. So that's what we're going to dive into a little bit more. But first, to quickly go over the differences. Grit is really about a good metaphor is let's pretend you're this little person and you have this job to cross this giant frozen tundra, like this wasteland, to get to these mountains. And what it really is that you can mentally prepare to be hungry and cold and tired, and then you just have to go for it. And it's about your ability to persevere through a non-changing system where everything stays the same that you can predict. Resilience, on the other hand, is completely different. It's about coming up with a brilliant solution in a chaotic system. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're in this frozen tundra, and then one night you are attacked by this bear. And just to quickly draw him out, it's something that's completely unexpected, or maybe you did have some ideas, but this it's happening right now, and you have to do something about it right now. And because you're clever and you remembered something that you read from books, is that you can just play dead, and the bear will leave you alone, and so that's what you do. What resilience is it's about being witty and being smart at this immediate time. And I think a lot more of these situations happen because in the chaotic Lorentz wheel, we hear about these more than we hear about this. So the big problem is that when we're dealing with resilience is that we're very, very stressed out, and we're actually biologically very not capable to be healthy, creative, and witty when we're very stressed out. What I mean by this is, just to do a quick thing on what is actually happening is, we have our brain, this is the brain, and the two main pieces that are important here is the prefrontal cortex, which is this part. It's not always green, but sometimes it is. And then you've also got the amygdala, which is this little set of neurons sort of back in there. Just not to go too much into the deep end with this stuff, but the prefrontal cortex, what happens here is that this is your ability to have some abstract thought. This is like the smart person brain, where you have like all of the higher order thinking, where right and wrong, good and evil. That all happens here. The amygdala, on the other hand, this is your emotional response for everything. This is where when you freak out, this is the animalistic side that gets turned on. Very often it's associated with fight or flight responses. And what happens actually when in times of stress, there's been a lot of studies that show that this side, the prefrontal cortex, where all of our good abstract thought happens, completely turns off, and the amygdala completely ramps up. So all of our emotional fight or flight responses go completely haywire. So at the time when we need to be resilient and when we need to be witty, we're completely not able to do that because we're just emotionally reacting to everything rather than thinking through and trying to come up with, remembering our past experiences on what we have to do. I've taken a lot of classes in emergency response, and I've got to shadow a lot of doctors who are in the emergency room. And one of the things that we're taught is that when people are facing a medical crisis, very often what they'll actually do is that instead of seeking help or anything, they'll run to the bathroom to try to deal with it themselves. And so if you see somebody just all of a sudden run to the bathroom, they're probably going through something terrible, and you might want to just keep an eye on them. And that is very much a fight or flight response rather than the abstract thinking. That's sort of what we're talking about. So we see instead are people having the completely wrong responses to situations. We've seen this where people will, instead of doing, the right thing, they'll just do something that they know what to do and that they're comfortable with instead. A good quote that I found is, if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. And this is very true. However, one of the first things that we heard about is that some of these operators are swimming in quicksand. They're literally still digging even though they're in a hole. So what's going on here? And what we're seeing is that people are really telling themselves the wrong story. And the wrong story is very much about denial. It's denying the right problem that you have and facing a completely different one instead. So a quick anecdote is, one of the operators was telling us about how a lot of the people, he was dealing with a lot of customer complaints and he was trying to figure them out, and it was taking this huge toll on his body, and his health was suffering because of it. And he ended up dealing with the customers more and more and more, and his health turned less and less and less. And only when he actually decided to deal with the health issue and take some more time for himself did he actually start becoming better, and thus starting to come up with better solutions to the problem that he was facing. Um, there's actually this entire language around stories that are filled with denial. Denial. What it really is that you have a person who is ignoring the facts and information and implications and consequences of everything that's happening, and instead what they're doing is that they're coming up with this rationalization on what they should do instead. And so this is a type of story that we hear very often in when people are not being resilient. There are, we'll hear people just having some sort of excuse instead of actually doing the right thing. So if that's the wrong type of story, then what's the right type of story? When I was studying up on resilience, I created this 2x2 that can analyze a situation, and using this 2x2, we can analyze what is actually the right type of story to have. This axis here, the x1, is your perception of a situation. So something could either be pretty bad or it could be pretty good. And then the next axis is your understanding of it. So is it completely expected to you? Is this something that you have seen before and know? Or is this totally unexpected? So a lot of our stories, especially when it comes to terms of resilience, is that it starts in negative and unexpected. And we call this being thrown into the deep end. Very often when people are in, full-fledged denial, what happens is that they sort of they don't recognize that something is happening here, and they stay here, and they never really end up solving the right problem. They just turn to solving the thing that they're comfortable with. But the right type of story that we're trying to track, though, is that you start from thrown into the deep end, and then you go into this quadrant here, which is the positive, unexpected quadrant. It's when you discover that you have some sort of talent or an ability, or you have this moment of clarity that you can do something. When you were attacked by the bear, it's that you remembered that you could play dead, and that's what you decide to do. So in this case, it's called You're a Wizard, Harry, like from Harry Potter, because you discover that you had some sort of power to change the situation. And then the last step in the right type of story is up to changing this to now becoming an expected situation. And in this one, it's business as usual. That's what this is called. An important note: this business as usual, might not be the same as it was before. When you've done a resilient action, what happens is that I was in this horrible time. I had this moment of clarity, and now I fixed it. And here's the situation I am in now. Might be different than what I was in before. The last one way to get out of it also that happens is sometimes if people don't deal with anything, then they go up this way. The situation might evolve in some sort of way, or maybe you tried something but it totally didn't work. That's okay, because you still tried something. And so it's become this expected situation, but it's still negative. And this type is called shot myself in the foot. In the foot. And that's what that's all about. We want to avoid this because, you never really want to get here. You sort of want to track this one. This is the right type of story that we want to have. The last important piece in all of this that is really, really important to get is context. I'll just tell a quick story about this one. I interviewed a woman named Katya about resilience, and she had this really, really interesting duality where, on one hand, she was very, very resilient in one type of situation. She sometimes works as a wedding photographer, and the way she described being a wedding photographer is that you're like it's that you're caught in a hurricane, and everyone in the wedding is all in here. They're in the hurricane, but her job is that she's in the middle where it's all very, very calm, and she describes that she gets to sneak around and be creative and cool, and she notices all of the little details that people are ignoring while everyone else is stressing out. She feels very, very calm here. So I would say she's very resilient in this situation. However, she then told me another story where she was on this road trip, and whenever she's going on a road trip, she gets extremely, hangry, meaning, she gets hungry and angry at the same time, but she doesn't realize she's hungry, and so she's just mad. And this happens every single time, and people always get mad at her, and they say, "How do you not remember that you're just hungry?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know." And it's sounding a lot like her, amygdala is ramping up and her prefrontal cortex is turning off. And so in this context, she's really bad, but in this context, she's very good at being resilient. And so context really, really will change your ability to be resilient in a situation. So what we've got is this hypervigilant brain where the prefrontal cortex is turned off and the amygdala is turned on, and it's in a state where it can't really be witty, and it's in a certain context that we don't know yet. So the first step is to take control of the brain. You've got to get this under control first, just so that you're not emotionally reacting to things, but you're actually thinking and using your abstract brain processes that it's good for. The second step is to understand the context and know, is this something that you are more apt to be resilient in or less likely to be resilient in, and to actually take a step out. So looking at it from the Lorentz wheel point of view, it's to actually see, well, what's actually happening, rather than trying to look at all of the different buckets and looking at, some of the water. It's looking at the whole thing and actually see what it's doing and understanding all of it. And the third step is to take some sort of action to fix it. And when you're taking an action, there's a couple of different things that can happen. So either it can go poorly, something bad happens, and, it happens. You kind of go into that shot myself in the foot category. When we were doing the 2x2, it was in this quadrant. You get there and you learn, and, it's not the best, but then something good happens, then it's great. You did the good transition of resilience, and you successfully outmaneuvered the bear. And the entire point is that you have to try. That's really what we're getting down to, is just by trying something, you're already being resilient. And what we were saying before with all that state of denial is that sometimes there's this weird thing that happens where you don't really do anything about it, and nothing bad ever happens and nothing good ever happens. It's that you ignore the problem, or you look at a totally different problem. And usually it's because, it's a fear of failure, or you're just comfortable staying where it is and you don't want something to change. And the situation keeps going and keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And that's where we get that, caught, trapped in a hole, trapped in quicksand that we keep hearing, is that they're not looking at doing the right type of action, regardless of where it goes. So what I want to leave with is that it is possible to practice resilience by coming up with the right contextual practices. And the question becomes, it's like, well, how can we actually practice resilience in the right context? So if we know that some of our operators and some of our teams are having problems, or they're not exhibiting resilient behavior when in a situation where the throughput is too high, or the Lorentz wheel is spinning way too fast for them, then how can we imitate a high throughput situation with lower stakes to help people get the context a little bit better? And with that, I'm going to turn it back